In the dense pine forests of northern Louisiana, hidden under generations of timber and silt and the slow accumulation of root systems, sits a structure that overturns almost everything we have been told about how human civilization began. 11 earthen mounds arranged in a deliberate oval connected by raised ridges, covering an area larger than a dozen modern football fields. The mounds were not built by farmers. They were not built by kings or priests presiding over irrigated valleys. They were not built by any society with cities or writing or metal tools or grain silos. They were built by hunter-gatherers, people who lived on fish and nuts and wild game, people who paid no tribute to any palace because no palace existed, people who somehow organized the moving of tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth without a single overseer cracking a whip. And they finished this monument almost 2,000. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. 1,000 years before the first stone was set at the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is the story of Watson Brake and what it tells us about the real economic history of the human species. The site sits about 20 miles southeast of the city of Monroe, in Washita Parish, in a stretch of land that most travelers would drive past without a second glance. For more than 5,000 years it lay essentially forgotten, hidden in plain view beneath a thick canopy of hardwood and pine. The local landowners knew there were small hills on the property. Hunters walking the ridges sometimes noticed the strange regularity of the rises, but no one looked twice. The mounds did not match anything the modern textbooks said should exist in that region at that depth of time. The site finally came to scientific attention in the early 1980s, after timber clearing exposed the contours of the earthworks clearly enough that a local woman named Rebecca Bamberg-Jones recognized what she was seeing. She had grown up in the region. She had spent years walking similar landscapes, and she understood almost immediately that the rises on that piece of land were not natural formations. They were too regular. They were too connected. The ridges between them ran in straight lines that no flood and no wind could ever have produced. She contacted state archaeologists. The first survey crews arrived shortly afterward, and what they found when the dating results finally came back from the laboratories was something that the academic mainstream of the time was simply not prepared to accept. The radiocarbon dates placed the construction of Watson Brake at approximately 3,500 years before the Common Era. That is roughly 5,500 years before the present moment. It meant the mounds had been raised by people who lived 2,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, 2,000 years before the rise of dynastic Egypt, 2,000 years before Stonehenge in its current form, 2,000 years before the great Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it meant, even more uncomfortably, that the site predated the next oldest mound complex in North America, a place called Poverty Point, by close to 2 millennia. For decades, the assumption had been that Poverty Point represented the beginning of monumental architecture in the Americas, and that even Poverty Point was unusual because it appeared to have been built by people who had not yet adopted full agriculture. Watson Brake pushed that boundary back so far that the older explanation broke down entirely. There was no longer any way to account for the construction within the standard framework. The people who built Watson Brake were not even on the doorstep of agriculture. They were classic foragers. They moved with the seasons. They followed fish runs and nut harvests and game migrations. And yet they built. When you walk the site today, the scale is hard to absorb. The 11 mounds vary in height from small rises of about a metre to the largest, which still stands more than 7 metres tall after 5,000 years of erosion. The complex is laid out in an oval roughly 280 metres along its long axis. The mounds are connected by low ridges that form the boundary of an open central plaza. The shape is deliberate. The geometry is consistent. The placement of the larger mounds relative to the smaller ones suggests a planned arrangement carried out over generations, not a random accumulation of dumping piles or refuse heaps. The volume of earth involved is staggering when you consider the technology available. There were no metal tools, there were no draft animals, there were no wheels and no carts and no organised work crews paid in grain rations. Every basket of soil was carried by hand, by people who had to fit this work around the daily and seasonal demands of feeding themselves through hunting and gathering. Modern engineering estimates suggest that the total earthwork at Watson Brake represents something on the order of tens of thousands of person-hours of labour, possibly more. Some calculations place the figure at well over 100,000 hours when the ridges and platforms are included in the count. And here is where the conventional story of economic development begins to fall apart. According to the model that has been taught in nearly every undergraduate textbook on the origins of civilization, large-scale construction projects of this kind should be impossible for a non-agricultural society. The standard sequence is supposed to run in a fixed order. First, a population settles down, then it begins to cultivate domesticated plants, then it produces a surplus of food, then the surplus allows certain individuals to specialize in non-productive labor. Then those specialists become priests and warriors and managers. Then the managerial class organizes the rest of the population into corvée labor for monumental projects. The monuments are, in this view, a kind of fossil record of the emergence of inequality. They are supposed to be evidence that someone had taken charge. Watson Brake does not fit this sequence at any point. There is no agriculture. There is no surplus in the textbook sense. There are no permanent dwellings of any size. There is no elite housing. There are no burials that single out high-status individuals. There is no concentration of luxury goods in any one part of the site. There is, in the archaeological record, nothing that should explain how this earthwork came into being. And yet there it sits, 11 mounds and connecting ridges, planned and executed over a period of several centuries. The economic implication is profound. It suggests that monumental labour can be mobilised by societies that have no surplus, no centralised authority, and no coercive apparatus. It suggests that human beings, under the right cultural conditions, will undertake collective construction projects voluntarily and sustainably over time spans that exceed any single human lifetime. It suggests, in short, that the assumed link between hierarchy and monumentality is not a law of nature. It is a pattern that emerged in certain places at certain times and was already being broken by other communities thousands of years before the first king ever sat on a throne. Consider what this means for the way we have been taught to understand wealth and labour. The story of economic development as it appears in most modern accounts is a story of pressure. Pressure to extract surplus, pressure to enforce work discipline, pressure to defend stored grain from raiders, pressure to mobilize masses of workers through fear of violence or hunger. In that story, the monument is the visible result of invisible exploitation. The pyramid stands because somewhere, somehow, an underclass was forced to build it. Watson Brake quietly suggests another possibility, that communities of relatively equal people, sharing food and tools and time, can choose to build something together that none of them individually require. That the act of building can itself be a form of social cohesion, a ritual technology, a way of marking the land and binding generations. That economy and meaning can be the same thing. The mounds at Watson Brake were not built because anyone needed mounds. They were built because the building of them mattered to the people who carried the baskets. This is not a romantic projection. It is what the archaeological evidence actually supports. The site shows signs of seasonal use rather than permanent residence. Families and groups would arrive at certain times of the year, likely tied to fish runs in the Ouachita River and to nut harvests in the surrounding hardwood forests. They would camp, they would process food, they would carry out whatever ritual or social activities the gathering involved, and they would add to the mounds. Then they would leave. The construction did not happen all at once. It happened in episodes, layer by layer, generation by generation, over a span of more than 500 years. That timescale alone breaks the comparison with Egypt almost entirely. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built in a single concentrated burst lasting roughly 20 to 30 years. It required the full mobilization of the resources of a unified state. It required the diversion of grain from agricultural communities up and down the Nile to feed thousands of workers in seasonal labor camps. It required a pharaoh whose authority could not be questioned, and it produced a single, sealed, sacred structure intended for one specific man. Watson Brake required none of those things: no king, no bureaucracy, no grain economy, no coerced labor, no singular monumental moment. The mounds were not a tomb, they were not a treasury, they were not a fortress. They were a place of return, a place that the same families and lineages came back to year after year for 20 or 25 generations, until something changed and they did not. What changed remains an open question. Around 2,700 years before the Common Era, the site was abandoned. The mounds were left standing, but the people stopped coming. There is no sign of violent destruction, no mass burial, no evidence of conflict or invasion. The most likely explanation involves shifts in the regional climate and in the river system. The Ouachita changed course, or the fish runs shifted, or the nut yields declined, or the lakes and bayous that supported the seasonal economy moved elsewhere. Whatever the cause, the gathering that had sustained the construction simply dissolved, and the mounds went silent for the next 5,000 years. But the absence of the people did not erase the lesson the site preserves, and the lesson, when you sit with it long enough, is unsettling for almost every economic worldview currently dominant in the modern world. If hunter-gatherers could organize sustained monumental construction without surplus, without hierarchy, and without coercion, then surplus, hierarchy, and coercion were never strictly necessary for collective achievement. They were one path among several. The version of history that treats them as inevitable, as the only possible engine of large-scale human cooperation, is a version that conveniently justifies the present arrangement of wealth and authority. It tells the modern reader that everything they see around them, from the corporate office tower to the tax form to the disciplined work week, descends in an unbroken line from the necessity of building the first irrigation canal and the first pyramid. It tells the reader that there is no alternative. Watson Brake is one of several sites quietly dismantling that story. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, dated to roughly 9,600 years before the present, shows monumental stone construction by pre-agricultural communities. Stonehenge began in a phase that was still tied to pastoral and mixed economies far less centralized than the kingdoms that would later inherit the landscape. Poverty Point in northern Louisiana, built later than Watson Brake but still firmly inside a hunter-gatherer and fisher economy, shows enormous earthworks moved by people with no domesticated grain. The pattern repeats. Wherever archaeologists have looked carefully at the deepest layers of monumental construction, the simple equation of surplus equals monument breaks down. What remains in its place is a more difficult and more interesting picture. Human beings, it seems, have always had a deep capacity for organizing labor through means other than coercion. Kinship networks, seasonal gatherings, shared ritual obligations, reciprocal feasting, cycles of debt and gift that do not require money or accounting. These are not exotic anthropological curiosities, they are the original substrate of human economic life. The monument is the visible signature of an invisible web of obligation that bound people to each other and to the land, without anyone needing to be in charge of anyone else. This is what makes Watson Brake matter for the field of revisionist economic history. The site is not just an oddity to be filed away. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It is evidence. And the evidence points toward a conclusion that economists, particularly those whose models begin with the assumption of scarcity and competition, find difficult to absorb. The conclusion is that scarcity and competition are not the foundational conditions of human economic life. They are particular conditions that arise under particular circumstances, often involving the emergence of stored wealth, defensible territory, and inheritable status. Before those conditions emerged, and outside of those circumstances, when they did emerge, human beings organized economic life on different principles. Watson Brake was built on those principles. Whatever those principles were exactly, they were sufficient to move tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth into a planned oval that has outlasted every empire that came after. When you stand at the site today, after the long drive through the pine forests and the gravel roads, the first thing you notice is how quiet it is. There are no signs, there are no parking lots, there is no visitor centre. The land remains in private hands and access is restricted in order to protect the integrity of the earthworks. For most of its modern existence, Watson Brake has been almost entirely unknown to the general public. Even within Louisiana, the name draws blank stares from people who would happily list the names of every pharaoh, from Khufu to Cleopatra. This is, in part, an accident of geography and ownership, but it is also something more. The reason the site is not famous is not just that it is hard to visit. It is that the implications of the site are difficult to fold into the standard narrative of human progress. A pyramid in Egypt confirms the story. The story says that civilization rises through hierarchy, that hierarchy produces grand achievements, that grand achievements justify hierarchy in turn. The pyramid is the perfect illustration. It is dramatic. It is symmetric. It is the work of a god-king. It fits. Watson Brake does not fit. It is older than the pyramid. It was built without a god-king. It was built by people whose lifestyle modern industrial society has been trained to regard as primitive or limited or incomplete. And yet they did something the modern industrial society itself struggles to do. They built a structure that lasted 5,000 years. They built it without exploitation. They built it without writing or wheel or metal. They built it without anyone being in command. The implications, once you let yourself sit with them, are not minor. They are the foundation for an entirely different way of understanding what economy means and what work is for. A new wave of researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and economic history has begun to take sites like Watson Brake seriously as evidence. They have begun to ask what kinds of economic arrangements could have produced these structures. They have begun to revisit older assumptions about the inevitability of hierarchy, the necessity of agriculture for large-scale organization, and the universal applicability of the surplus model of state formation. Their conclusions have not yet reached the textbooks in any consistent way, but the pressure is building. Among the most important reframings to come out of this work is the recognition that the deep economic past of the human species was not a story of slow progress from misery to civilization. It was a story of continuous experimentation with different ways of arranging shared labor, shared food, shared time, and shared meaning. Some of those experiments produced what we would call states. Many of them did not. The communities that built Watson Brake were running one of those non-state experiments, and they appear to have run it successfully for more than 500 years before the experiment ended for reasons that had nothing to do with internal collapse. That is worth pausing on. A non-state monumental project sustained across roughly 25 human generations. No internal collapse, no civil war, no revolt, no invasion that we can detect. The end of the project came, as far as the evidence shows, because the environmental and seasonal conditions that had sustained the gathering shifted. The people did not turn on each other. They simply moved with the new conditions, and the place they had built together fell out of their annual cycle. This is not the dramatic ending of a Hollywood epic. It is the quiet ending of a long, patient, cooperative undertaking that ran its course. Compare that to the trajectory of most state-level monument building. Egypt itself, the standard reference point, experienced multiple internal collapses and reformations across its dynastic history. The Maya cities of Central America were repeatedly abandoned. The Khmer complex at Angkor swelled and then thinned. The Roman building program halted in the Western Empire by the 5th century of the Common Era. State-level monumentality, on the whole, has a poor track record of sustained continuity. The communities at Watson Brake, with no state apparatus at all, sustained their building program longer than any single dynasty of any of the great agricultural civilizations. This is not an argument that the hunter-gatherer model is somehow superior. It is an argument that the hunter-gatherer model is real, and that it produced results, and that the standard textbook narrative which dismisses such societies as economically inert is wrong. The economic history of the human species is broader, deeper, and more varied than the textbook story allows. Watson Brake is one of the proofs. There is also a quieter, more personal layer to the story, and it is worth naming before we close. The people who built Watson Brake were not anonymous masses. They were families. They had names and relationships and personalities and memories. They had grandparents who had carried baskets to those same mounds. They had children who would grow up adding their own work to the same project. 500 years is not an abstraction. It is roughly 20 generations of grandparents and grandchildren overlapping in a single shared undertaking. Whatever else Watson Brake was, it was a place where the connection between past and future was a tangible thing, made out of earth, located in space, returned to on a calendar set by the river and the seasons. That sense of intergenerational presence is something modern industrial economies struggle to produce. We build for fiscal quarters. We measure success in years, occasionally in decades. The idea of a project sustained voluntarily across 20 generations with no central authority enforcing the continuity sounds almost mythological from inside our current economic logic. And yet the evidence sits in the ground in northern Louisiana, surveyed and dated and published. The people who did this were not gods or aliens or members of any lost civilization. They were ordinary human beings making different choices than the ones our current arrangements demand. The revisionist economic historian looks at Watson Brake and sees, in essence, a kind of counterexample held in earth. A reminder that the choices being made about labour and meaning and time in any given society are choices, not necessities. That the assumption that human beings will only work if forced or paid is a recent assumption, not an eternal truth. That the connection between hierarchy and monumentality, between agriculture and civilization, between state power and collective achievement are connections that emerged in particular places and can be unmade in other places. This does not mean Watson Brake provides a blueprint for the present. The conditions of a small mobile fisher and forager population in the lower Mississippi Valley 5,000 years ago cannot be transposed onto an industrial society of billions. But the site provides something more valuable than a blueprint. It provides a refutation of inevitability. It tells the modern reader that the present arrangement of economic life, with its specific relations of surplus and hierarchy and coercion, was not preordained. It was assembled piece by piece from particular choices made under particular conditions. And like any assembly, it can in principle be disassembled, modified, or rebuilt on different foundations. That is why Watson Brake belongs in the curriculum of revisionist economic history. Not because the lower Mississippi forager tradition can be revived, not because the modern world should build mounds, but because the site refuses to confirm the story we have been told. It sits there, older than the pyramid, with no king and no army and no scribes, and it refuses to confirm. Few sites do that. Most of what survives from deep antiquity comes to us through the filter of state power. The temples that survive are the ones the priesthood maintained. The records that survive are the ones the bureaucracy preserved. The dead who are remembered are the ones whose tombs were grand enough to attract attention. The history of pre-state societies is overwhelmingly the history of what they did not leave behind, because they did not leave behind palaces or treasuries or written archives. Their actual lives, their actual economies, are mostly invisible to us. Watson Brake is one of the rare cases where they left something visible, something that could not be erased by the next state that came through, something built into the ground itself in volumes too large for any later authority to undo. That is what gives the site its weight in the revisionist tradition. It is a piece of evidence that survived in spite of itself. It survived because it was too big to move, too deep to plough under, too remote to develop, and too uninteresting to subsequent state economies to bother destroying. By the time the first European descended the Mississippi, the mounds were already 4,000 years old and covered in trees. By the time American settlers reached northern Louisiana, the site had passed entirely out of human memory. By the time the modern archaeological community got around to it in the 1980s, the assumptions that should have made the site impossible were already calcified into the academic literature. And so the site arrived in the modern conversation as a kind of slow earthquake. It did not announce itself loudly. It simply sat there, dated and surveyed and quietly impossible. The work of the revisionist economic historian is to read sites like Watson Brake correctly, to resist the temptation to dismiss them as marginal or anomalous, to resist the temptation to fold them into the dominant narrative by inventing missing chieftains or lost agricultural phases or vanished elites who must have organized the work because, well, someone must have. The evidence does not require those inventions. The evidence is consistent with a non-hierarchical, non-agricultural, non-coercive form of monumental cooperation. The only thing required to accept that is the willingness to let the evidence speak. Letting the evidence speak is harder than it sounds. The economic models we have been trained in do not have a column for what Watson Brake represents. They do not know what to do with sustained voluntary cooperation across many generations in the absence of any of the institutions the models are built around. They do not know how to value the cohesion of a seasonal gathering, the social weight of a return migration, the binding force of ritual obligation. These do not show up as variables in the equations, and yet they were sufficient to move tens of thousands of cubic meters of earth. They were sufficient to outlast almost every empire whose monuments we still remember. If you take only one thing from this documentary, take this. The pyramid is not the oldest monument. The pyramid is not the standard. The pyramid is one solution to one kind of social organization, and it is not the only solution that humans have produced. 2,000 years before the first stone went up at Giza, in a forest in what would much later be called Louisiana, a different kind of people were already doing a different kind of thing. Their solution did not require a god-king. It did not require a granary. It did not require a written language. It required only that people kept coming back, that people kept carrying baskets, that people kept passing the work along to the next generation, and that people kept remembering why. We do not know exactly why they remembered. The ritual content of Watson Brake has not survived. No carvings explain it. No songs were written down. The intent that animated the construction is gone, and what remains is the geometry of the result. But the geometry is enough to tell us that whatever they remembered, it was strong enough to organize labor on a scale that the modern world struggles to organize, even now, with all its money and machines and management theory. That is the lesson the site offers, not a complete economic system, not a model to copy, just a reminder that the human capacity for sustained cooperation is older, deeper, and stranger than any of the recent economic theories that try to account for it. A reminder that civilization, in any meaningful sense of the word, did not begin in the palaces of the river valleys. It began wherever people first decided that something worth building was worth building together, and worth coming back to year after year, and worth handing on. In northern Louisiana, in a quiet stretch of forest near a river that has since changed course, 11 mounds and a set of connecting ridges still hold that decision in earth. They were old before the pyramids. They were old before the wheel reached most of the continent they sat on. They will likely still be there, in some recognizable form, long after the present economic arrangements of the world have themselves become a layer of silt, for some future archaeologist to dig through, and whoever digs them up next will be welcome to read them however they choose. But the evidence will continue to say, in its quiet, stubborn way, what it has been saying for 5,000 years, that there was another way, that there is still another way, and that the people who built it left their proof in the ground for anyone willing to walk out and look.